the fifth and final round here on Beyond the Cage, presented by Fight Chicks. And inside of round number 5, we are going to pick the main card for UFC 171 from Dallas, Texas, this Saturday on pay-per-view. Round number 5 is brought to you by our good friends at TopRatedMMA.com. Like them on Facebook at TopRatedMMA. The first fight of the evening will be at 205 pounds as Ovince St. Preux will take on Nikita Krylov. Looking at OSP, he is 2-0 in the UFC, overall riding a 3-fight win streak. His last fight was a victory over Cody Donovan at Fight Night 26, and 7 of his 14 career victories are by knockout. Looking at Krylov, he is 1-1 in the UFC. His last fight was a victory over Walt Harris at Fox 10, and his 2 fights in the UFC and in his career have been at heavyweight, and he will be making his light heavyweight debut in this fight, and 10 of his 16 career victories are by submission. Looking at this matchup, Dave, I know Krylov is making his light heavyweight debut, but in some information I looked at SheerDog.com, they listed him at 218 pounds. He's never been an overly big heavyweight, thus the move down to 205 pounds, and with good reason. Even though he was able to beat Walt Harris is a pretty big guy. He weighs over 240 pounds. In his first fight in the UFC, he had to take on the Hulk Solo Palele, which is a mountain of a man as well. So I think eventually, even though he got some victories and did okay in his career, he realized some of these guys that the UFC have are huge at heavyweight, and he just couldn't compete. And so he had to make the move down to 205 pounds, which I think will suit him a lot better. And he's taking on a guy in Ovince St. Preux who is a very solid competitor, a guy that can be wild at times, a guy that can have a low gas tank and kind of gas out, that is, but he is very tall, very lanky, and a very athletic and explosive individual, as he used to be a former football player. So he has a lot of intangibles that a lot of fighters don't have coming from a different sport background. But with that said, I think Krylov just technically is probably the better mixed martial artist.
Yeah, Krylov was the guy that he was the curtain jerker, as they say, when I was at that Fox card in Chicago. And, he came all the way over from Russia, and it 25 seconds into the very first round, he was victorious. And, he's a rangy fella, being 6'3", what was his reach? About 78 inches is his reach. And he posed problems for Walt Harris in that very quick fight. We didn't see a whole lot of striking, but what we did, it was pretty damaging striking. So I think that he's going to give OSP quite a bit of fits. And I can definitely get on board with your... You think Krylov is a more technical fighter, or a better technical fighter than OSP. I could definitely get on board with that.
Let's move on to the next matchup in the welterweight division, as former Strikeforce middleweight champion Jake Shields will take on former Bellator middleweight champion Hector Lombard. Looking at Jake Shields, he is 4-2 in the UFC with a no contest. His last fight was a victory over Damian Maia at Fight Night 29. He is unbeaten in his last 4 fights, and 16 of his 29 career victories are by decision. Looking at Hector Lombard, he is 2-2 in the UFC, 1-0 since dropping down to welterweight from middleweight. His last fight in his welterweight debut, he defeated Nate Marquardt at UFC 166, and 19 of his 33 career victories are by knockout. Pretty simple, Dave. If it stays standing, Hector Lombard's probably going to knock out Jake Shields. If it goes to the ground, I know Lombard is a judo black belt, a tank of a man at about 5'9", and just a solid brick there at 170 pounds. And Jake Shields, we all know he has a great jiu-jitsu background, a very suffocating top game, but if he gets this thing to the ground, he's taken down some big guys before, has held them there, and has come out victorious. Not pretty, but he gets victories, and if he can take Hector Lombard down, he can win, but if not, it's probably going to be a short night for the man from San Francisco.
As always, very good technical breakdown. My question for you is, on Twitter and other places, I've seen Jake Shields talking Does a win over Hector Lombard give Jake Shields a title shot? He thinks so.
Man, I tell you what, it definitely puts him in the conversation, but I think it has to be decisive because you can make an argument that he could have lost his last two fights against Tyron Woodley and Damian Maia. Both those were very close, controversial split decisions. And if he goes out there and dominates Hector Lombard for 15 minutes, and there's no question whether it's pretty or not, Dave, that he beats Hector Lombard, I think you can make a case. But if it's a very close fight once again and he still gets the victory, he probably would have to fight one more time, either against maybe a Rory McDonald or a Carlos Condit, or even rematch Tyron Woodley, I think, before he gets the title shot.
I know we're getting a little off topic, but your breakdown was so good that I'm trying to bide some time here. I think, like you said, it has to be a decisive victory for Jake Shields, and I think a lot of it's going to depend on the co-main event and some of the other fights, because this is a big moving day for the welterweight division coming up Saturday with 6 of the top guys fighting. If Carlos Condit and Tyron Woodley go in there and slug it out and it's super close, they're probably not going to let Jake Shields slide in. They may give him the loser of that fight. Long story short, Jake Shields needs to go into this fight and be decisive in victory in this fight.
The next fight of the evening will be in the lightweight division as one of the first Ultimate Fighter winners, Diego Sanchez, takes on Miles Jury. Looking at Jury, he is 4-0 in the UFC and undefeated in his career at 13-0. His last fight was a victory over Mike Ricci at UFC 165, and 6 of his 13 career victories are by knockout. Looking at Diego Sanchez, he is 13-6 in the UFC, 3-2 at 155 pounds. His last fight at UFC 166 was a loss to Gilbert Melendez, and 9 of his 24 career victories are by submission. Even though Miles Jury has looked impressive in just about every one of his fights so far in the UFC, racking up a perfect record at 4-0, he was not particularly exciting or impressive in his victory over Mike Ricci at 165. And really, if you look over some of the guys he has fought so far in the UFC, maybe with the exception of Michael Johnson, he really hasn't taken on anybody that big or I think really that talented. And now he finds himself on the main card of a pay-per-view, something that he's never done before, and he's taking on a guy the caliber of Diego Sanchez, who has been in the UFC a very long time, who has taken on and beaten some of the top guys in 2 different divisions, and is a guy that is a very tough matchup because of the pace and intensity and aggressive nature that he can put on you. And I think that despite him maybe not being the best at 155, it is a big test for Miles Jury taking on Diego Sanchez in Dallas.
Interesting matchup. All experts would probably pick Diego Sanchez in a landslide in this fight. I don't think that's the case. I really think that this could be this is a big moment for Miles Jury. Like you said, he's undefeated, 13-0, 4-0 in the UFC. The light is not going to shine any brighter for this young man. You're on pay-per-view behind a big title fight. You got a guy who is going to bring it in Diego Sanchez, and this is the time for Jury to step out there. And is he a pretender or is he a contender? We'll find out Saturday.
The co-main event of the evening will be in the welterweight division as former WEC and interim UFC welterweight champion Carlos Condit will take on Tyron Woodley. Looking at Woodley, he is 2-1 in the UFC. His last fight was a victory over Josh Koscheck at UFC 167, and 5 of his 12 career victories are by submission. Looking at Carlos Condit, he is 6-3 in the UFC. His last fight was a victory over Martin Kampmann at Fight Night 27, and 14 of his 29 career victories are by knockout. And on a side note, he also has 13 career submission victories. Dave, this matchup I think is going to be excellent. Both guys have power in their hands. Both guys have pretty good stand-up. Both guys are really exciting and fun to watch. And the X factor in this fight is going to be if Tyron Woodley implies a wrestling-based attack. Carlos Condit is good off his back. I mentioned he also has a lot of submission victories to his credit. He's not a guy that just lets you lay on top of him. He's always working to get either back to his feet for a submission or do damage from the bottom. You can ask a lot of people about that. But I think standing up, even though Woodley probably has the power to knock out Carlos Condit, which is easier said than done considering Condit's never been finished in his career, but standing up, Carlos Condit has the height and reach advantage, and he has shown that he is a very tricky guy to stand up with on several occasions, and I think best display of that was when he fought Nick Diaz, as he put together a masterful game plan against Mr. Diaz to win that fight. And I just think standing up with Carlos Condit for 15 minutes is not something you really want to do. And I think for Tyron Woodley, he's really going to have to go there and try to take this fight to the ground. And even though that's also kind of going into a dangerous area, you got to try the lesser of two evils, I think.
If it's possible, Jim, I think I'm more excited for the co-main event than I am for the main event that's going to follow. Carlos Condit, I think clearly he's one victory away from the title shot. I wouldn't have been surprised had they given it the Hendricks-Condit fight if they would have made that for the belt. I'm cool with the way it's worked out now, but this Condit versus Woodley fight is one that, being at UFC 167 when Woodley beat Josh Koscheck, I kind of knew who Tyron Woodley was. I had seen some previous fights and whatever, but he really laid it on Josh Koscheck. Now I know Josh Koscheck isn't the Koscheck that we remember. He's not at a super elite level right now, but the power that he showed in that fight, I think, can definitely be an X factor against Carlos Condit. Like you said, standing in front of Condit for 15 minutes, probably not the best idea for your career or your face or any part of your body, because Condit will tear just about anybody apart. But the power that Woodley has, I think, is a huge X factor in this fight, and not to mention his wrestling skills. But to me, I put my money on the co-main event. I think that fight's going to be the fight of the night. Got to tune in Saturday and find out, I guess.
Well, let's get to the main event of the evening, as Johnny Hendricks will take on Robbie Lawler for the vacant UFC welterweight championship. Looking at Lawler, he is 7-3 in the UFC, currently riding a 3-fight win streak. His last fight was a victory over Rory McDonald at UFC 167, and 18 of his 22 career victories are by knockout. Looking at Johnny Hendricks, he is 10-2 in the UFC. His last fight was a loss for the welterweight title to GSP at UFC 167, and 8 of his 15 career victories are by knockout. And I think the X factor for both gentlemen in this fight, Dave, is conditioning. Both gentlemen are big 170-pounders. Both have had issues with conditioning, and that's one of the reasons why Robbie Lawler, for some of his career, fought at 185 pounds as opposed to fighting at 170. Since returning not only to the division but to the UFC, he has looked very impressive in all 3 of his victories, and I really think that's going to be the difference, because I think these two are almost the same guy. Obviously, Hendricks, I know, is a national champion wrestler, but Lawler has a pretty good wrestling base, more from a defensive standpoint than an offensive standpoint. I mean, this guy lived and trained and worked with Pat Miletich and Matt Hughes for how many years out there in Iowa, and now he still works with some great wrestlers out there in Arizona where he trains, one of them being Ryan Bader and I believe CB Dalloway. So this guy has been around wrestling, even though he hasn't done it at a level like Johnny Hendricks did. So he's not going to be unfamiliar with Johnny Hendricks is going to be featuring. And power-wise, flip a coin. I think both arguably are the 2 biggest hitters in this division, but I would say overall striking game lies with the former Strikeforce and Elite XC fighter in Robbie Lawler. And like I said, it's going to be who can kind of have that gas tank, because both have the ability to end the fight with one punch.
Yeah, definitely. Both fighters can end it at a moment's notice. You know me, Jim. You're really good at the technical breakdown, but as you were talking, I was listening. A couple things that pop into my head is Lawler's not going to have too many more shots at this. Lawler's been around for a while. This may be his last attempt at getting a belt. Hendricks may have a couple more shots left in him. So I wonder if that plays a factor. I wonder if it plays a factor with Johnny Hendricks being from Texas, being in Texas, main event, everybody wants him to win, all of that kind of stuff. And then to your point about the gas tank, there's a lot of pressure and stuff building up to this fight. I wonder if it, maybe not so much who has the best gas tank, but who doesn't have that huge adrenaline dump. Because whoever wins this is going to be the first welterweight champ in 6 years? Is that what it is? 5 years?
It's definitely a lot. Really, besides that little blip when Matt Serra upset GSP, was the only other champion we've had besides two men, GSP and Matt Hughes. So the welterweight division has long been dominated by just a few individuals.
Do you think those options that I brought up are those things that could play into it, into the ending of this fight?
Absolutely, because if one guy kind of rocks the other early and then is unable to finish because both guys are very tough gentlemen, and then has a big dump, and then in rounds 2 and 3, they're not at the level that they were, that's going to really seriously impact the fight. I guess you could kind of say, kind of like when Gray Maynard fought Frankie Edgar. If something like that happens, it definitely can change the outcome of the fight. With that said, Dave, let's get to picks.
Cue the pride music.
The first fight of the evening will be in the light heavyweight division as Ovince St. Preux will take on Nikita Krylov. I think this will be a fun fight, Dave, but give me the Russian and Krylov to win this one.
Yeah, there's something about me watching guys in Chicago, and then they go on to be great. The last one I can think of was Weidman, and, he's like, the middleweight champ and stuff. So I'll go with Krylov.
At welterweight, Jake Shields will take on Hector Lombard. I think Shields will have a tough time taking down the judo black belt in Lombard, so give me the Cuban to win this one.
I'm going to take the Cuban, and I'm going to one-up you. I'm going to go submission from Hector Lombard.
At lightweight, former Ultimate Fighter winner Diego Sanchez will take on Miles Jury. I think Miles does have a chance, Dave, but I'm going to go with Diego Sanchez to win this one.
Jim, just because I feel like it, I'm going to go Miles Jury.
The co-main event of the evening will be in the welterweight division as Carlos Condit takes on Tyron Woodley. I think this is going to be a great fight. Like you said, Dave, very well could be the fight of the night for this 171 card, but I'm going to go with the natural-born killer to win this one.
I think that this is a very, very close fight, a very, very exciting fight. I'm going to go with Tyron Woodley.
The main event of the evening for the vacant welterweight UFC title, Johnny Hendricks against Robbie Lawler. Another close fight, another fight that should be fun. It should be exciting, but I'm going to go with the man to upset the hometown guy and give me ruthless Robbie Lawler to win this one.
I'm definitely going to go with Johnny Hendricks in this one. I think he brings it home for the hometown crowd. The UFC's got a sweet story. Then we can book Johnny Hendricks and Tyron Woodley because I'm going to nail these picks.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Beyond the Cage podcast with Jim Gramm and Dave Sadler. For more Beyond the Cage, like us on Facebook, facebook.com/Beyond the Cage podcast, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Beyond the Cage podcast. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm at Jim Gramm, and Dave is at Vigilante Juice. And you can also send us an email, beyondthecagepodcast@yahoo.com. We would like to thank the following websites: VigilanteMMA.com, MMAinsider.net, MMAforlife.ca, MMA-Freak.com, and TopRatedMMA.com for their support of Beyond the Cage. Be sure to listen to the show on the Stitcher Smart Radio app, and you can also check us out on iTunes. Once again, for myself, Jim Gramm, and my co-host Dave Sadler, thank you for listening to Beyond the Cage, presented by Fight Chicks.